guys, welcome back. My name is Alan and this is Gryphon Studio. I hope you're all doing well. This week I've been making a Hags Hut or a witch's cabin or anything you want to call it. I was inspired by Black Magic Craft where Jeremy made this kind of gritty, less high fantasy, more realistic, grungy, swamp-like terrain for the Hags release and stuff. So I wanted to make my own little kind of spin on something like that. So I've been wanting to make a Hags Hut for a while, so I figured I would just try and tackle it this week, and that's what I've done. The interior is also playable. If you want to just, you can put this on the tabletop on its own, or you can add it to the little stage area here, and that would be a playable interior as well. Also, you can stick a little tea light in there or something if you want to, kick up the ambiance a little bit. So, yeah, I'm really quite happy with it, and let's just crack on, shall we? Alright, shall we begin? I'm going to use a piece of Formex for the base. Of course, you could use something like MDF or whatever. Something that doesn't warp would be ideal for this. And I'm going to build up on top of this Formex a bit of sculptor mold. This is this kind of dried mixture of plaster and maybe glue and paper fibers. I don't know, it's this weird texture, sort of like cottage cheese, but you add water to it and it becomes a very moldable substance, and it cures fairly quickly, and it's good for building up a fairly deep ground texture in a very quick and easy way. It is obviously quite messy with the fingers, but it's not really a problem, and you're going to have to kind of tend to this as it begins to cure, and sort of keep on it for maybe 5 minutes or so as it begins to dry out, and just continue to smooth it down with your fingers. This is one of the only times I've ever really used it, but it's a really useful modeling tool. I'm going to add some foam rocks that I made there. I had some scrap pieces of foam lying around, and I just kind of cut them into a rock shape and textured them with an aluminium ball. I'm just going to press these into the sculptor mold while it's still wet, and then mold the sculptor mold around the base of the rocks and hopefully smooth it out. You notice I've left a little area here at the front where there's no sculptor mold, there's no groundwork placed, and that's going to be a bit of a swampy area, and hopefully have some kind of clear resin in there. Now, I wanted to make a tree for this. I actually did this step first, but I'm going to include it here. I just took some florist wire, quite long pieces of florist wire, I think about 18 inches long, and just bent them in half, and then began to twist the wire with some needle nose pliers there into these kind of twisty branch shapes, and every so often you just kind of gather a few wires together and twist it off in a different direction, and eventually you get these branches forming. And this is a really clever way of creating these natural tree shapes. Of course, you can bend these as well, and eventually you end up with something that looks really quite authentic and quite natural. It can be a little bit hard on your fingers and it's a bit time consuming, but I think it's worth it in the end. You generally do yield a pretty good result. And once you're happy with the tree, you want to try and make the roots. So you could just try cutting through 20 pieces of forest wire at the same time, or you could be normal and just cut through 1 or 2 at once, and that'd probably be more useful. And then just kind of splay them out and create them into these little root shapes and twist them together to create thicker roots and thinner roots. And eventually you'll have something that looks very, very tree-like. And if there's any unsightly branches or bits that are a little bit too long, you can of course just trim them back to a desired length and reposition them as you see fit. There you see the roots there really starting to take shape, and they look really good, I think, at this stage. but we're going to add a little ingredient here to the outside of the tree. And the ingredient is earth texture paste. This is by Vallejo, and they produced this really interesting kind of thick gritty paste, which I figured would like sink into all the crevices around the tree, in all the kind of twisted forest wire, and really kind of helps smooth it out a little bit, but also applying some decent texture to the outside. So I did this across the entire area of the tree, and honestly it didn't take that much texture paste to do all this because there's not a lot of surface area on these branches. And that's it with it all finished. And I just, whilst the sculptor mold was still damp, I placed this and kind of wedged it between those rocks and made sure that the roots weren't going to interfere with the rocks, just kind of put them in between. I did a little bit more sculptor mold around the edges to sort of solidify it into the base, and hopefully it wouldn't rock around and go anywhere. Then I took some pieces of dowel. I wanted to put the hut on some stilts in the swamp, because obviously if it was in the swamp it would just kind of get waterlogged and flooded, so I figured some stilts would be good. So I took some dowel pieces and shaped them up a little bit, and then stuck them into the ground with some no nails glue. But since this entire building is sat on some stilts, I figured I need a way up. So instead of using ladders or something simple, I just cut out a piece of foam stairs. These are really probably a little bit easier to make, to be fair, and I stuck them down with some hot glue, and that would be the way up to the main entrance of this hut. And then I took a little bit more sculptor mold. This stuff is actually coming in really handy in this project, and I put it on either side of the stairs just to really kind of cement it into the landscape, make it look as though the stairs were built into the rock or into the earth, so that they weren't just kind of freely standing there looking a little bit weird. So the idea was here just to kind of smush this sculptor mold up to the stairs, up to the rocks, and create a little bit more of a natural earthy appearance. And to supplement this, I added a few more foam rocks. Alright, now while all that is drying, I'm going to make the base of the hut. This is going to be the bit that sits on top of the stilts. So I'm just using a piece of thick card. This is some graphics medium weight chipboard. I apply a bit of glue to it and press down a piece of very thin balsa wood. This is about 2 millimeters thick. And we're going to texture it with a wire brush. Yeah, I know balsa wood already has texture, but it's really a good idea to apply this this wire brush technique to it, because it really brings out all that wood grain and really exaggerates it for the model. The thing is, with obviously foam, you have to do the same thing with foam. But I find that my foam doesn't work that well for getting a nice wood grain texture, so I'm using balsa wood in its place, and I feel like that has a really good texture to it. I'm going to put in some planks here using a beveling tool and an X-Acto knife, and then poke in a few little nail holes with a sharp tool. But honestly, I found that these nail holes weren't particularly visible after painting it. So I think next time I'll use something a little bit less sharp to create a bit more of an exaggerated hole. And then I added some glue. This is just some Gorilla Wood glue to the sides, and I pressed on some pieces of balsa wood, and that would act as like a little lip that would go all the way around this entire piece. Okay, so the main bulk of the hut is just made of graphics medium weight chipboard. I just cut out some sections and made it a little bit janky. I wanted this roof to be like weirdly sloped, so it's this kind of really odd shape, and there's a little bit that butts out there on the right, and this is all just glued together with some tacky glue and things, and held together with paper clips. And then I'm going to clad this whole thing in balsa wood again. So it's the same technique as before. I'm just going to stick it on and then texture it afterwards. I'm going to do that with the entire house. So I did stick on a few bits of balsa wood strips here, not the whole thing was cladded, just most of it. And I sort of textured these and added little nail holes and a few bits of extra wood planks to kind of make it look like it was a little bit cobbled together out of scraps, really. And once that was all glued, I started to apply a roof. Now the roof here is again all different lengths of coffee stirrers just applied to the roof in haphazard ways. I just wanted this whole thing to be very uneven looking, like it was just made with the wood that they had on hand and not really any particular construction method involved, which really suits my building style quite a lot, I think. And sticking with the theme, I wanted to create a roof that wasn't necessarily all one material, so not all shingles, not all tiles. So I went with planks of wood and thatch, and also a little bit of animal hide as well. I really just wanted this thing to look kind of gross and dirty and something that, you know, is not a good dwelling for a normal person. So there's the amount of wood that I want on the roof. And then I started to apply the thatch to the roof in the places that didn't have wood on them. I obviously stuck it with wood glue to the main slats. I actually got this thatch material from an old sweeping brush that wasn't going to get used anymore, at least not after this. I'm going to be honest with you as well, this process took about one eternity, and yeah, it was very, very irritating. But it's done, and I'm just going to kind of neaten up the ridge of the roof here with a bit of tissue paper just to try and smooth it out a little bit. And all of this tissue paper is just being stuck down with some watered down PVA glue. I'm then going to take a much bigger piece of tissue paper and kind of drape it over the entire ridge, the whole top section of the roof there. And this would serve as a really big kind of animal hide. Of what animal I am completely unsure, but it's huge and you know, it's pretty cool. So I'm just going to kind of drape it over. I want this thing to be really kind of a disgusting place to live, you know, and thatching your roof with animal hide it's probably not the best way to do it, but hey, you know, this is kind of a hag's hut, so you know, anything goes really. And while that tissue there on the roof was still wet, I started to drag against the edges of it with this kind of sharp metal tool here, and that would create these really natural tears and splits that would probably occur in these kind of like old animal hides. And I just put a few holes in it just to make it look a little bit more raggedy and unkempt. And going back to the base for a while, I'm using some PVA glue here, going all around the base, all around these sculptor molded areas of the base, I should say, with this PVA glue, and that's going to get a pretty healthy dose of some basing sand, or pretty much all over it. And then I added a little bit of snow nails glue to this kind of section in the middle here, which is raised up a little bit. Please excuse the shadow of my fat head while it's in the way. So I'm just going to place a few of these little balsa wood steps, which is going to create this really unsafe looking bridgeway that goes across the swamp up to the steps. And all of the foam got the usual black paint and Mod Podge treatment. And then the rest of it just got sprayed with a rattle can of black spray primer. And then I got a little bit of a brown spray primer over the top of that as well, just to give me a bit of a head start on that muddy appearance. And then I took some medium grey paint and I overbrushed all of the stonework and then just kind of dry brushed pretty much the entire thing. And I applied a watered down green paint to the kind of swampy areas, the areas I wanted to be swampy. You will obviously also notice that there are a lot of barrels and skeletons and skulls and crates and things just kind of being applied to this over the course of the build. These are generally last minute decisions that I just wanted to add a little bit of visual interest to the piece. Then I took some sepia wash, or kind of a brown wash, and I just went over all of the muddy areas because it was starting to look a little bit too dry, a little bit too light, so I wanted this thing to be really dark and grimy and, well, just unpleasant. And back to the hut. So the entire hut got a base coat of a brown spray paint that was the same one that I used on the base. I wanted to really tie these things together. I don't have an airbrush at the moment, so I'm still using rattle cans, and I'm filling in the details with a paintbrush. So the tissue hide on the roof is just going to get a pretty basic tanned hide colour, and then that'll get a wash over the top of it with a black brown wash that I use for pretty much most of my projects. And then the same wash will go over all of the woodwork on the hut and hopefully bring out all of that detail. So I'm mixing up some resin here, some 2-part resin. I added a few drops, well I say a few drops, quite a lot of drops of wash to it. Some of it was black, brown, green, all different colours to really sell this swampy, grungy, horrible, disgusting marshland sort of vibe. And it had to be quite opaque because the area that it's covering here is quite a shallow pool. So for it to be kind of opaque, it needs to be quite a lot of paint to resin ratio. So just add it in small bits until you get the desired amount, and try not to drop any resin on the rest of the base like I just did. The resin will resist kind of rolling up to the shore of this swamp, so you do have to kind of tease it into position there with a cocktail stick just by dragging it into where it needs to be. I then added some vines, which are just made out of roots from the garden, which have been dried out for a while, and I stuck them kind of into the resin there as it was drying, and I just painted those up with a little bit of a black brown wash just to tie them into the terrain. And then once the resin was dry, I took some gloss and Mod Podge and put it over the entire thing just to add some surface ripples. and I did this with a straw, just blowing through it. Of course you can use an airbrush or something if you have something like that available, but I don't, so I'm using a straw, and it's very low budget and very useful. These surface ripples really go a long way to add a level of kind of dynamicness to a build. I think they really help sell the water effect as actual water rather than just this kind of flat sheet of glass. And you can also throw some leaves on there, some little birch seed leaves, and I added some little mushrooms as well. Okay, so at this point the tree in the background of this little diorama terrain thing was looking a little bit bland, a little bit bare, and I wanted to spice it up a little bit, so I took some string, separated the fibers of the string into tiny strings, and then chopped those up with some scissors, just eyeballing the length of these. And then I put those in a cup with some watered down PVA glue and some green paint. Mix those up until you get this kind of weird, like, I don't know, whatever the hell this is. And then I just sort of draped those over the branches a little bit. It would have been easier to do this if there was more glue in the mixture, and they would have hung a little bit easier. They would have sort of draped a little bit easier over these branches. And I did add quite a few of these in the end. I went back and forth, adding a few more every so often. But first it's time to add some moss. So if you're a frequent viewer of this channel, you'll know how much I love doing this step on all of my builds. I just think it really brings the build to life. It really gives it a sense of age and a weathering that you can't really get from anything else. So I'm just going to add a few bits of moss. I found this little plastic head here. I sort of stuck it on a bracket and stuck that to the hut as well. And there's moss on everything now. It's all over the base, all over the steps and everything. I then went back to these vines. I wasn't completely happy with them, and I covered them in some PVA glue and water. And then, although I missed filming this step, I sort of sprinkled over some Woodland Scenics Fine Turf Green all over those vines, and it really helped them to look less string-like and a bit more vine-like. And then the last step was just to place the floor of the hut onto the base. There we are, guys, all finished. I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. I think the key to this kind of build is to really make it look dirty and grimy and weathered, and I think it's quite janky as well, you know, make it look like it's not up to code, make it look like it's kind of ruined and dilapidated and things like that, because that really helps to sell the age of it. And I wanted this Hags Hut, this witch's cabin, to look like it's been here for, you know, a century. and I think that really helps to sell the environment. Also, the little interesting details that I like to add to my builds, things like, you know, skulls and barrels and crates and things like that. If you are interested in picking up some really cool sculpts of crates and barrels and bottles and things like that, you can check out Angry Stag Wargaming, which is where I got these from. They do really good, affordable sculpts, and they're not 3D printed. They are cast in resin, and they're really good. So yeah, feel free to check those out. There's also a few extra bits from my bits box in there as well, and yeah, I think it all helps to tie it together really well. Adding the moss is obviously like one of my favourite parts to any project, and really helps to sell that kind of aged, weathered look. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to leave a like and a comment. I'll try and get back to everybody if I can, and I am also on Instagram. If you want to check me out on there, please feel free to do that as well. I do have a Patreon set up if you want to check that out. My existing Patreons there, the Honorary Gryphons. I'm really thankful to all of you guys for all of your support and financial support, and also advice and criticism as well, and feedback. Like, that's really useful to me, and I'll try and make things that you want me to make. So if you want to get me to make something, sign up to the Patreon and I'll do my best to make it. So that's it for this one. I will see you again next time. Thanks for stopping by, and happy crafting.